Welcome to the Equestrian Author Spotlight, episode 25. Today I'm speaking with award-winning author, journalist, and attorney Milton C. Toby. Milton has more than 40 years of experience researching and writing about thoroughbred racing and equine law. He is the author of 8 books, including Taking Shergar, thoroughbred racing's most famous cold case, Dancer's Image, the forgotten story of the 1968 Kentucky Derby, and youre, a champion thoroughbred's unlikely journey from California to Kentucky. Now, let's get into the interview. Welcome to the Equestrian Author Spotlight podcast, a podcast featuring interviews with equestrian authors who love all things horses and writing about them. In each episode, you'll hear inspirational stories from horsebook authors, including writing advice and marketing tips to help you write your very own horsebook. If you're an author, aspire to be an author, or simply love horsebooks, then you are in the right place. I'm your host, Kade, and creative writing makes my spurs jingle. Hi everyone, welcome to the Equestrian Author Spotlight Show. I'm Kade, and today I'm so excited to have fellow author and horse lover Milton Toby on the show. Hi, Mil.
Hi, Carly. Thanks for having me on the show. I'm looking forward to it.
I am too. So this is a little different than the last time you saw me. The last time we saw each other was at the Equus Film Festival, and I had lost my voice. So this is very different.
Yeah, I'm glad you've recovered finally.
It's pretty difficult to try and help people out and be social when you can't speak. So
no kidding.
This is an opportunity for me to redeem myself with you.
Good.
Oh, and Milt was so kind as to fill in on the author panels and be a moderator for me in my place because I couldn't talk, and you did an excellent job. So thank you for that too.
Thanks. That was fun.
It was. You were great at it. I mean, you have a journalistic background, so it certainly helps. So, and which we'll talk about as we get into the interview here. But I always like to start these interviews off because this is the Equestrian Author Spotlight, talking about how the authors I'm speaking with got involved with horses. So how did your love affair with horses begin?
I have been involved with horses in one fashion or another for as long as I can remember. I grew up in central Kentucky with Saddlebreds. I showed horses through high school and while I was in college. And then I began writing after I graduated from the University of Kentucky with a BS in agriculture. And my first published article was in 1972 about the Belmont Stakes for a small newspaper in Aiken, South Carolina. And I haven't been writing very much since then, but I've been writing about horses, primarily thoroughbred racing and legal issues involving the horse business ever since. So it literally is a lifelong love for me.
Yeah, and that's so interesting. So many authors, and I'm the same way, that I've been talking with on this show, it like literally starts the moment we come out of the womb, this love of both writing and horses. And it sounds like that is the same story with you.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And then Saddlebreds. Why Saddlebreds? Is that like your family's breed of choice, or?
Yeah, my family had Saddlebreds that we showed locally and, at some national shows as well. But so that was my start.
That is awesome. And that's another interesting thing too. Like it tends to be the case that you tend to get into the breed that either your first trainer is a part of or your family is a part of. Would you say that seems to
be? Exactly. That was the only horse interest in my family were the show horses.
Mm-hmm. And that's great. We need more men showing horses. So you probably, you were like one of a few, so you could pick up the ladies. I always say they should put the young man go show horses because that's where all the women are.
That's right.
That's awesome. So, and as I was galloping around your website, gathering information for our interview questions, I found this really interesting too. Your wife is an equine veterinarian and also an author and an editor in her own right. So does it help you with your writing to have a veterinarian and a fellow author to bounce ideas off and actually fact check the medical information that you may be writing about in your books?
Yeah, it really does. And it was something that I hadn't given a whole lot of thought to until I saw that in one of your questions. But yeah, Roberta has been writing, doing freelance writing for a very long time, and she also was an editor for the Lloyd's Equine Disease Quarterly that the University of Kentucky Department of Vet Science put out. She did that for more than 2 decades. So she's a very, very good editor, and she catches stuff that I miss all the time. Yeah, my writing is better because she takes a look at it.
Yeah, my husband does a little bit of the same for me. He's like my first editor. He goes through my chapters every weekend after I'm done writing and catches things that you stop seeing after a while. And then, so does she edit your books, or do you pass them through her first and then work with another editor on the other side?
She sort of is involved as we go along. Yeah, I show her a chapter or I show her a paragraph and we discuss that. But as far as the final editing goes, it depends on the publisher. My last book was published by the University Press of Kentucky, and I worked with a very good copy editor that does contract work for them. She was a joy to work with. And like with Roberta, the book was better because of things she thought of and things she caught.
I totally agree. I mean, editors, always work with an editor. They definitely make your work better. I wouldn't, my stories wouldn't be as strong as they are if I hadn't had good editors along the way. And then what's interesting is you mentioned, and some people don't know this, you mentioned editing and then copy editing. Can you tell us a little bit about the difference between the two, just for those that are listening and that may be aspiring to be an author and might not know this terminology yet?
Sure. Yeah, for me at least, a copy editor is someone who goes through the manuscript with a fine-tooth comb. They pick up grammar, they pick up punctuation, they pick up misspellings, they pick up the mechanics of what the writing is. A development editor, on the other hand, is somebody who doesn't look so much at the mechanics. They look at the story. They look at where it's going. Is it getting where you want it to be? And the advantage there is you have someone who doesn't know the story as they're reading it the first time, so they can know better where it makes sense and where it doesn't. I was lucky. My copy editor also was very good at saying, this chapter might go somewhere else. Mm-hmm. So it was very helpful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that makes a world of difference because they're reading it with clear eyes after we've touched it a bazillion times, and they can tell you from a different point of view if something doesn't make sense or something needs to be expanded upon to make it make sense, right?
Exactly. And for somebody who is an aspiring author, yeah, and like as you say, I can't recommend more that you need to have professional editing. Mm-hmm. No matter how many of your friends and how many of your family say this is wonderful, it probably isn't. And you need somebody who is impartial, who can say, well, hey, this needs some work here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because it's whether you independently publish or traditional publish, it is a responsibility to put the very best product you have out into the world when you're taking on this writing endeavor, and editors do help you do that, and it's very important. So we can't stress that enough, right?
No, absolutely, and particularly for people who self-publish.
Mm-hmm. I agree. Very much so, yeah. So, I always say with independent publishing comes a lot of power, but also a lot of responsibility. And you have all the responsibilities of the traditional publisher to make sure that you are releasing the very best product when you put your book into the world and you give birth to these book babies.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so and that's just fascinating. Thank you for the insight on that. And we do go into the interview in a little bit in a little while more about writing and marketing and the process of how you work. But I was wondering, I always ask this question too. Do you have any stories that listeners would find interesting about either your writing or your horse background? Is there like one moment that sticks out in your mind that is just kind of interesting or funny?
Something that had never occurred to me as being a problem. I did a 3-book series for the History Press in South Carolina, a book about Dancer's Image, who was disqualified in the '68 Derby, a book about Youre, and a book about Canyonero II. And one of the volumes that I was doing for them, the copy editor came back with wanting to refer to horses as it.
Ah, interesting.
And technically, he's right. He was right about that. He was going by the Chicago Manual of Style, which if you don't have one on your desk and you're a writer, you need to get one. But I explained to him that he was technically right, but people who read the book and are horse people are going to be offended if you refer to a horse as it. And we went back and forth for quite a while, and finally he saw the light. And we were able to change that in the book. And surprisingly, that wasn't an issue for the other two history press books that I did, but it was for this particular one. And he was very adamant about that. But finally, he agreed that, yeah, we will offend horse people who see horse referred to as it. So
that is very interesting. I've never really thought about that, because you are writing from the perspective of a horse person, and to us, they are he, she, her, him,
mm-hmm.
right? And then, but your editor, who is going by the rule books of the English language, is saying it. So, and you eventually won that battle, because it does make sense for your reader, right? This was a decision for your reader.
Exactly, but it raises an interesting question about who your audience really is. Because if you are reading a book about horses and you're a horse person, yeah, this all makes sense. But if you're trying to move outside of a horse-related readership, which I always like to think that I'm doing, then you have to figure out how much explanation you have to provide for the person who doesn't know horses. And it can get really complicated.
That is a very interesting question. But then I would think, for people outside of the horse realm, or that aren't close to horses and don't have them, would maybe like associate a horse as like similar to like a dog. And I think people think dogs are he and she, right? Would you say they'd be able to make that connection?
Yeah, I would think so. We talk very personally to our dogs and the cat. But I was thinking on a broader scale. Think of Seabiscuit for a second. It was wildly popular with people who knew the Seabiscuit story and who were horse related, but it was also wildly popular with people who liked the explanations of the era and what was happening there, not so much related to the horses. So if you're trying to reach a crossover audience, you need to make sure you're understanding enough of what they don't understand to include that in the book too, rather than writing strictly for someone who knows everything there is about horses.
That makes a lot of sense. And that's a great piece of advice for authors, right? Do you want to pigeonhole yourself just for the equestrian community, or do you want to put enough information in there to help it have broader reach, right? So
exactly.
I think that's what we're getting down to. And for further books that you're writing, what do you think you're going to do? Are you going to go the it route, or are you going to go with the gender term for the horse?
No, I'm going to go with what the horse people expect to see. Everything that I've written, a horse enthusiast, or for me a racing enthusiast, that's my primary audience. So that's who I'm going to cater to first. But I also want there to be enough in the book that isn't specifically about a horse or specifically about a horse-related topic that will, I hope, appeal to somebody who doesn't know the story, doesn't know anything necessarily about racing.
Absolutely. And I think that your writing speaks to history buffs too. People interested in the history at the time that these things were going on, much like what was going on with Seabiscuit, right?
Exactly.
Very, very interesting. Thank you for sharing that with us. So this is really interesting too. I wanted to talk a little bit about your background. You are an attorney and an author who has been writing about thoroughbred racing for more than 40 years. How have you married being in law with the horse business? Is it like what type of, or even the writing business? Like how did you make the decision, or how do they kind of work together?
That is a difficult question, because the practice of law was career number 5 or 6 for me, depending on how you count. It was something that I came to in my 40s.
Oh, wow.
Long after I had been writing. I worked for the newspaper in South Carolina for a year. I worked for the Blood Horse magazine for 12 years. I lived overseas and did freelance news photography for 6 years. Came back and went to law school in the early 90s. But through all of this, I continued writing. While I was traveling, I did pieces for the Blood Horse about racing in the Philippines, racing in Hong Kong, racing in China, racing in Costa Rica, racing in Colombia, racing in Puerto Rico. So I kept my hand in, but I was mostly doing photography during that traveling. But then once I began practicing law, I thought, well, okay, I'll practice equine law, because I live in central Kentucky and that's what you do. Well, if you live in central Kentucky, almost everybody practices equine law, and there's a lot of competition. So I actually spent most of my active legal practice representing inmates on death row in Kentucky. That was about 15 years of my legal practice.
Wow. Uh, that's amazing. So I'm like, whoa. So you have a massive journalistic background. You traveled to all these fantastic places, and then you reinvented yourself as a lawyer or an attorney. And then you kind of thought about the equine industry, but then you shifted because of you reinvented yourself and you shifted it and you represented death row inmates. I can't even imagine, what was that? I can't even imagine what that experience was like for you.
It was a very sobering experience. I had 4 clients on death row over the course of almost 15 years. And it was very difficult, but it also was very rewarding.
I can only imagine. And did you sort of fall into representing that type of person, or was that a choice?
Well, it was a little of both. When I was looking for things to do, I set up a practice with a friend of mine from law school. We set up a 2-person practice, and there's a public defender's office in Kentucky like there is everywhere else, and they had conflicts of interest from time to time. Mm-hmm. And I inherited a couple of clients that way because they had conflicts. And then the more of it I did, I got recommendations actually from other inmates on death row. So that was how that developed. But I continued to be interested in horses, first of all, but also in the legal aspects of writing because I was still writing. And, copyright issues, publishing contracts, that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. So that has led to kind of another reinvention of myself into someone who wants to give back to a profession that's been very, very good to me.
That is amazing. So as you're pursuing law, you continued to write and support do writing, freelance writing, and then were you writing books prior to becoming an attorney, or was that something that happened while being an attorney?
I had a book actually that was published, a series of interviews I did with a very famous veterinarian in central Kentucky while I was with the Blood Horse. But then I didn't really get back into the book writing until I was also practicing law. I did a couple of books about business and equine law for Eclipse Press, which was the publishing aspect of the Blood Horse for a while. Mm-hmm. I also did a biography of Ruffian for them. And I did a handbook on equine law that was published by Eclipse Press. It's 10 years out of date now, but it's still used in college equine courses. So that really was the only real marriage between equine work and writing and the law. And then I shifted to the history press, and then the last book and the one I'm working on now are for the UK press in Kentucky. So it just sort of goes on and on and on.
And I mean, what an adventure you've been on in this reinvention of yourself, but always continuing close to the heart, keeping it with the writing and the horses. And I can only imagine your schooling and then your experience as a lawyer made you, which we're going to get into here, a better presenter, a better writer, better with people. I can only imagine that you're already amazing with people from your journalism experience, but I'm sure it only just made everything that you're putting out there in the world better.
Yeah, absolutely. It all sort of works together toward a goal, which is communicating.
Yeah, that's really incredible. So let me ask you this. Why in particular thoroughbred racing? Why was that what you were drawn to write about? You have a lot of books about thoroughbred racing, which we're going to talk about your books here in a second, and you work for the Blood Horse and you did a lot of freelance writing around thoroughbred racing, but you grew up with Saddlebreds. So tell us a little bit about why thoroughbred racing.
One of the things that I have always told people is that everything that I've done is nothing that I've ever planned to do. And getting involved writing about thoroughbred racing was one of those things. When I graduated, I was looking for work, and I wrote to a dozen newspapers and said, I've got a BS in agriculture. I have a horse background. I know nothing about journalism. Would you like to hire me? And 12 of the 13 newspapers, of course, ignored me. But this little newspaper in Aiken, South Carolina, which is a winter thoroughbred training center, wrote back and said, it'd be easier to teach you how to write than it would be to teach a journalist about horses.
That is true.
They hired me. I spent a year there. And as I said, the very first thing I wrote that was ever published was an article about the 1972 Belmont Stakes. And from there, I came to the Blood Horse, which is, of course, a thoroughbred magazine. And so you get kind of entrenched in that particular sport, and that's where your contacts are. That's what you know. So you stay with it.
Yeah, and I love hearing stories like that, because it's almost like you're following, you know, whatever's calling you forward and just saying yes and stepping into that role. And then like, look at what it's become. You know, you could have said, I don't know anything about thoroughbred racing, I'm not going to South Carolina and taking this job. But instead you accepted it and you said, I'm going to step into this, and look at what it's generated for you. That's really
and it's been a great trip.
That is awesome. Yeah, it's been an amazing ride and journey, and look at how you've invented yourself over and over again. Which leads me to, I know you're working on a project right now, but you mentioned to me that it's going to, you know, be out there for a little, it's going to be a minute before that one comes out. So tell us about your most recent book. And then let's get a little into your backlist. Maybe talk about, you've already mentioned some of the things that you've written about, but tell us a little bit more about your books.
Well, the current book, and this was an award winner at the Equus Film and Arts Festival, which I was really excited about.
Congratulations. Well deserved.
Thank you. But the book is called Taking Shergar, Thoroughbred Racing's Most Famous Cold Case. And when I was working at the Blood Horse in 1983, the big news item from Europe was the theft of a stallion named Shergar. He had won the Epsom Derby. He was one of the most famous horses in the world. He probably was second or third most valuable horse, certainly valuable thoroughbred in the world in the early 80s. And he was stolen on the eve of the 1983 breeding season. He was held for ransom, and the ransom was never paid. The horse was never recovered. So there have never been any arrests. There have never been any charges. There have never been any convictions. So that's why I'm calling it a cold case. The file is still open officially with the Irish police, which meant that they wouldn't give me the file to take a look at. So I had to do research around that problem. But there's no doubt in my mind, and in the minds of a lot of people, that it was the Irish Republican Army who stole the horse. They needed money because they were running out of funds to buy weapons and explosives. This was in the midst of the Troubles when they were trying to drive the British out of Northern Ireland. So that has to be the reason.
Wow, that must have been fascinating to research and learn more about. And so the horse was stolen and never recovered, and I'm sure you cover this in the book, but then how did they make money from the horse? Or
they didn't. It was an absolute failure for the Irish Republican Army. They didn't get any money, and they got an incredibly bad publicity. The thinking apparently was they were kidnapping people. They were kidnapping grocery executives and holding them for ransom, and that wasn't going well. And they decided, apparently, that if you kidnap a horse, people won't get mad about it. Well, they didn't. They underestimated how much the Irish love their horses.
Oh, yeah.
And there was more bad publicity about Shergar being stolen than there was about any of the executives who were kidnapped.
Wow.
And that, I think, is why the Irish Republican Army has never officially claimed responsibility for taking the horse.
Because they don't want the bad press. That sounds fascinating. So how do you choose the topics that you decide that you want to write about, and then do you stumble upon these things and then decide you want to dive deeper and use all that journalistic background that you have to get the facts?
It's a little of both. I was interested in Shergar from the time he was stolen because I was working at the Blood Horse and keeping track of that in the early 80s. But in general, I look for a story that people think they know, but in fact they don't. And Shergar was one of those. Everybody that I know of who knows anything about racing, if you mention Shergar, they either don't know anything about it, or they say, oh yeah, he was stolen by somebody, and that's all they know. So the book was, very little of the book is actually written about the theft, because there was a lot of coverage of that in the press at the time. The book is really about what happened politically in Ireland that led to the theft, and then what happened afterward. there were a lot of legal issues. This is getting back to my training as an attorney. There were a lot of legal issues that came up, particularly involving insurance.
Mm.
The horse was owned by a syndicate of 35 people, and most everyone had mortality insurance, and they also generally had theft insurance.
Mm.
If you had theft insurance, Lloyd's of London was the primary insurer. If you had theft insurance, you got paid because the horse clearly had been stolen.
Mm-hmm.
But if you had mortality insurance only, you didn't get paid because there was no proof he was dead.
Oh my goodness, what a mess.
They still, they still haven't found the remains. So a very prominent veterinarian in Ireland who basically mortgaged a lot of his property to buy a share in Shergar didn't have theft insurance. And he died early, or in 2019, still fighting the insurance companies.
Oh my goodness. And what a disservice to the racing industry, right?
Yeah.
To have stolen this horse, and his genetics are just gone, right? And this could have changed his bloodlines, could have changed the face of racing. So it was not only a disservice to all these people that were in the syndicate, and then the public who are loving this horse, but then also, you know, the future of racing was impacted by this. So
yeah, he sired one crop. His first year in stud was 1982. I think he covered 44 mares and had 36 registered foals. And a couple of them were very good. One horse won the Irish St. Leger, which is a group one race in Europe. And, you know, there's no telling what his offspring could have been.
Right. Wow. That is fascinating. Thank you for sharing that. And of course, I'll link to all of Milt's books in the show notes, so you can go check out his book and get a copy, because this is fascinating. And then, you know, I did mention a little bit about your backlist. Will you tell us a little bit more about some of the other books that you've written? Yeah, I know you've written a lot, so maybe highlight your favorites or.
Sure. Well, my favorite book is the one I'm working on at the time, because it occupies so much of your life for a period of time. With the book about Shergar, that was a 3-year project. Actually, probably a little longer than that, because my wife and I made 2 trips to Ireland and England. We did a lot of research here in the States, did a lot by phone. So that was my favorite at the time. My favorite when I was working on the book about Dancer's Image, that was my favorite book at the time. So that's the way it works. Yeah, I don't have the mind that allows me to work on a lot of different projects at once. I don't multitask well at all, which may be an age thing. I don't know, but I don't shift gears very quickly. So that's my favorite book. The 3 books I did for the History Press, each one was a different book to do. The topics were different, the horses were different. Dancer's Image was the only, until 2019, the only Kentucky Derby winner to be disqualified. And it was a drug test that there were a lot of questions about the validity of the test. There were questions about the competence of the state chemist. And that case went on there were 5 years of legal wranglings after he was disqualified, which I found fascinating, again, because I'm an attorney. And that allowed me to probably present a perspective that no one else had done about Dancer's Image.
Well, certainly.
Because, again, a portion of the book was about the horse and how he got to the Derby and the fact that he won and then was disqualified. But 2/3 of the book is about the legal issues that came up afterwards. That was fun at the time. The book before that, also for the History Press, was about a horse named Youre. Youre was an Irish bred. He was a champion in California in 1950. He beat Citation 4 times at the time. And then he stood for stud at a farm in Northern California. It wasn't particularly successful. And when he died, he was buried in an unmarked grave in the middle of the training track at the farm.
Oh my goodness.
He was a champion in the US, but that was the end of people knowing anything about Youre for decades. Until a few years ago, part of the farm was sold to make a business center. And there was a wonderful woman in Northern California named Charlotte Farmer. She is the most excited racing fan that I know. And she was convinced that this would be a sin to pave over Youre's grave. So she began a one-woman campaign to find Noor, find the grave, find somebody else who would take him to be reburied, and then to actually get people to help. She got volunteer archaeologists. She got a volunteer technician with ground penetrating radar. She got a volunteer person with a backhoe, and they began making the rounds in the infield of this track. And the last day they had access to the property, they found a grave. They didn't have time to do a real archaeological dig. So they loaded about 2 tons of dirt with the backhoe into a custom-made box on the back of a flatbed truck and drove it to Kentucky.
Wow.
They had looked for places who would take Noor's remains. The racetracks in California weren't interested. The Museum of Racing in New York wasn't interested. They called Michael Blowen, who, if you know old friends in Georgetown, Kentucky, about a mile and a half from where I live, it's a retirement farm for thoroughbred stallions. She called Michael, and Michael said, yeah, sure, bring him on. And he told me that he was convinced that she wouldn't be able to do it, so he thought saying okay was all right. He didn't think it was going to matter. And then Charlotte shows up with this box of dirt that has a few of Noor's bones in it.
Wow.
So he's buried at Old Friends. So this book, the first part was about Noor as a racehorse. The second part was about Charlotte's campaign to do justice to Noor. That's the sort of thing.
Is so cool. What an amazing story to tell and do justice to this horse. So they buried him in an unmarked grave because he didn't produce as a stud. Is that right?
Probably, but also burying horses wasn't quite the big deal then that it might be now. And he wasn't a successful stallion, and then he died. And what do you do with a dead horse?
Right.
They buried him in the infield.
Yeah. That is, well, thank you for telling a story and doing justice to that. That is incredible. And then you did tease us about your current, there's more in your backlist, but you did tease us a little bit about what you're currently working on. Can you give us a little sneak peek of what your current project love is?
Sure. It basically is a comprehensive history of performance enhancing drugs in racing.
Oh, perfect timing for something like that.
So, and that again is requiring a lot of research.
Mm-hmm.
And the only reason that I accepted this, my idea was that the book about Shergar would be my last book. I turned 70 last year. Mm-hmm. And this is a lot of work, and I had a lot of other projects going on. Mm-hmm. But this was too enticing to not do. Mm-hmm. And as it turns out, as I say, I've done a lot of research about it. The most recent article that the Blood Horse ran, it was a long form piece, almost 8,000 words, about a guy named Harry Anslinger, who was the head of the first Federal Bureau of Narcotics. In the 1930s, he decided to clean up racing. So he had his agents on the backstretch for over a year, gathering information. And he wound up raiding Arlington Park in 1933. He indicted 200 people, including some big names in racing. And then he just sort of lost interest. Huh. But it was the first attempt for the federal government, to get involved in horse racing as a regulatory agent, which is still an issue now. The Horse Racing Integrity Act is in Congress right now. Mm-hmm. That would have federal oversight about drug testing. Mm-hmm. So it applies to what's happening now, which is one of the interesting things. I also did a story, another long form piece for the Blood Horse. We were talking about Seabiscuit. Mm-hmm. Seabiscuit's trainer was a guy named Tom Smith. And after Seabiscuit retired, he continued training and was very, very successful. But he was involved in the very first major trainer drug case that ever hit the courts in the mid-1940s. So I did a long-form piece about that called Silent Tom's Atomizer. The atomizer was what he was using to use ephedrine in the nostrils of his horses. He wasn't trying to dope them, I don't think. He used ephedrine himself because he had nasal problems. He thought it'd do the same thing for the horse.
Like help them breathe better? Yeah,
exactly. He didn't, I don't think there was any intent to use it as a performance enhancing drug, but it was prohibited at the time. And after a lot of legal cases, Tom Smith lost. And the article, again, it was another very long thing. They run those on the internet site. They're too long to be in the print magazine. But that also won an award at the Equus Film Festival this year as the best magazine article, Silent Tom's Atomizer. So I've done a lot of research already for drugs and racing. So that was the appeal of updating all that and putting it together.
Well, it's a timely project, and that's fantastic. And it sounds fascinating just to dive into this sort of stuff, and what you're talking about too. It's a testament to the fact that history repeats itself, right? Like,
yeah. One of the things that Harry Anslinger did a couple of years later, he invited veterinarians or representatives from all the racing commissions to come to his office. And the result of that meeting was a press release that said everybody agrees that there needs to be a centralized governing body for horse racing. This was in 1935. We are now 65, 75, almost 85 years later. People are still saying we need a centralized governing body in horse racing. So You're right. History repeats itself over and over and over again. And that's my interest in history. If you don't know where we came from, you don't know how to go somewhere. It's really important.
That's right. Yeah. And thank you for the contribution you're making to helping us take a look at not repeating history. It's like we should know better by now.
Yeah, you would think.
Yeah. Well, I had a quick question too. Do you have a couple copies of your books there for the people who are watching us on YouTube, so they can see your beautiful covers? The covers of your books are so gorgeous.
Yeah, this is taking Shergar, and I love the cover. The picture of the horse is him galloping prior to the 1981 Epsom Derby.
It is a beautiful cover.
He won by 10 lengths. It's the largest winning margin ever before and ever since in the Epsom Derby.
Do you have a say on your book cover? Did you have a say on that book cover, or did the publisher do that for you?
It was a little of both. I got the photographs from freelance photographers in Europe and gave them to the press and told them, these are the dozen photographs that I like, but they picked the one they wanted. It wasn't the one I would have chosen, but it's a better choice than I would have made, which is why I like professional help when you're doing a book. And they picked this one as the cover. They did all the design. Yeah, I had no input at all other than to say, hey, that looks really good. Let's do that.
Well, that's great. But you did provide the pictures. So
I provided the photographs, yeah. And that's something else to keep in mind. Even if you're working with a traditional publisher, the way publishing works these days, you're going to be doing a lot of the groundwork, a lot of the legwork. You're going to be gathering the photographs. You're going to be gathering permissions to use the photographs. If you maybe a decade or two ago, the publisher might have taken care of that for you, but it doesn't work that way anymore unless you happen to be Stephen King or one of the really big name guys. So you need to be prepared for a lot of legwork that doesn't involve sitting in front of the computer writing.
I'm actually glad that you mentioned that, because I think for some newbies, the idea is that you write the book, hand it over to a publisher, and they handle all the marketing and all the everything, right? But so much more nowadays is falling onto the author to handle a lot of that stuff, like build a following, get readers, promote yourself, like you said, getting the rights to utilize photos for your covers. So I'm really glad you mentioned that.
Yeah, absolutely. The promotion is probably at least as important as the book that you write. And I'm not good at that. I hate networking. I would rather get poked in the eye with a sharp stick than network. I'm not on social media very much. I follow it, but I don't participate in it very much. So I'm sort of a dinosaur when it comes to the way you need to promote a book these days. And luckily, with the History Press and also with the University of Kentucky Press, they have publicity people who will work with you. A lot of times they won't know particularly who they need to contact because they don't have the contacts in the industry that I do. But if I gave them a list of you need to contact A, B, C, D, E, and F because they do radio programs or they write or they do something that promotes racing, then the publisher would then get in touch with them and say, hey, do you want to set up an interview? Do you want to set up a book signing, whatever. And for me, that has worked, but it's worked partly because I know the industry after been doing this for 40 years. So I have contacts that no publisher is going to have.
Right. Well, and that's the truth. You know your demographic and the readers better than a publisher ever will.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So if you've got somebody who's willing to do the work after you give them the contacts, then you're way ahead of the game. But they're not going to hunt contacts down for you just out of the blue. It isn't going to happen.
Well, and that's a great thing to share, because there's a responsibility that does fall to the authors to
absolutely
to get the word out about their books, no matter which route you choose to publish. So that's really fascinating. And then back to your books, I wanted to ask you about Dancer's Image. You mentioned this book. This is really cool. So Dancer's Image, the forgotten story of the 1968 Kentucky Derby, was the winner of the $10,000 first prize in the Tony Ryan Book Awards, honoring the year's best book about thoroughbred racing. And it also won an American Horse Publications Award, which we are both members of, as Best Equine Book of the Year. Congratulations, first of all, that's amazing. And then,
Thank you.
How did earning such prestigious literary awards make you feel? And how did you decide to enter your book and go for these things?
For me, and I can't speak for anybody else, but for me, and this probably is a shortcoming, but validation in the form of an award of some kind is really important. I find it really difficult to look at something that I have written and say, this is really good. I think it's very hard. And if the book wins an award, or if the magazine article wins an award, like taking Shergar and the Tom Smith article at the Equus Film Festival, that's a big deal. It isn't something that I require to have happen, but it's really nice when it does.
For sure.
So for me, it's an added benefit of doing something that I love doing. And if I didn't know that people were going to read what I wrote, I wouldn't write. I know a lot of people write because they have a drive to do that. I don't. I write because I want to communicate, and an award means that I have communicated with somebody. Yeah,
and that's a journalist in you too, wanting people to read what you've written, and you do deep work, and you really go into the topics, and you tell the history, and you really get in there. So $10,000, what did you do with that? Did you go on a fun trip? Did you reinvest in your business and writing books? Did you do anything cool with that prize money?
If I did anything cool, I don't remember it. What I remember doing primarily is paying the bills that went into writing the book. Because that's the other thing with the book. You work for 1 year, 2 year, 3 years, and you're not making any money. You're running up bills. And that's another nice thing about having a lot of sales. But it's also nice about winning an award that comes with some money. Most awards don't. That's the only thing I've won that actually gets you some money. So yeah, I probably broke even.
Yeah, that's true. There's a lot of upfront costs when it comes to working on a book and writing a book. And then, obviously for what you do, you mentioned, with your last book, you had traveled to Ireland a couple of times to do your research. So there's expenses that go into these things. Yeah. And did your publisher provide you with an advance or to put towards the research and stuff, or did they not?
No, they don't. The History Press didn't. The Eclipse Press didn't. The University Press of Kentucky doesn't. It's the sort of level of publishing that you're involved in. And if you're doing horse books, you're kind of at not the bottom, but you're in sort of a middle tier where you get support from a publisher. The Shergar book looks great. It looks better than I could have ever done if I'd done it myself, but you aren't going to get an advance. That's the downside. The upside is if you don't get an advance, you start earning royalties with the first book sale.
Exactly. Yeah. Can you explain a little bit, maybe for new authors that are listening to the show, how those advances actually work, being that you are an attorney and you understand these things? Because people think it's just free money, but you actually have to pay that back. Is that right?
Yeah. Well, you don't have to pay it back. Let's say that I get a $10,000 advance for a book. That's $10,000 advanced against the royalties that the book will earn. So what that means is that the publisher is saying, I think that your book will make at least $10,000 in royalties. So we're going to give you that $10,000 now, but you won't get any more royalties until it's called earning out, until your book earns out the advance. So until my royalties would equal $10,000, I'm not going to get any more royalties. You typically don't have to pay it back, but you aren't going to get royalties unless the book earns enough for you to have equaled the advance that you got in royalties. And when you're talking about royalties, you're not talking about very much money. The going rate now for a hardcover book is about 12%, and it's 10 to 12% of net, which is basically wholesale, which for a $30 book, net wholesale is probably $16, $17, $18. 10% of that, 12%, you're looking at a couple of dollars a book. So if you get a $10,000 advance, it's going to take a while. For the book to earn that out. And it's something that a lot of new authors don't realize.
That's right. Yes. Thank you for explaining that. And then I guess I didn't know that if the book doesn't meet the 10,000 or 6,000 or whatever they give you, I didn't know that generally you don't have to repay it, but that means you don't make any additional money from the sales of the book. So the book's a complete flop. You don't hit that $6,000 marker. You may not have to pay back the money, but you don't get any money.
That's right. Yeah. And depending on your contract, there might be a situation where you have to pay it back. Say that you get an advance and you just never turn in a manuscript. The publisher might want you to repay that. But once the book is published and is starting to go on the market, the advance is yours.
Got it. Well, and the idea though is you write these books and you want them to be making money in a stream of revenue, albeit a small stream of revenue for, as long as you live, for the life of the book, and even maybe beyond, right? So you want the books to sell and that marker. And I feel like I could talk to you for 1,000 hours because you have such a wealth of information. I want to talk to you a little bit about this too. I mean, since we're kind of in this legalese sort of space around writing and being an author, you are the president of the American Society of Journalists and Authors, the nation's leading organization representing freelance writers. Can you tell us about this organization and what membership entails and how you came to be president?
Sure. Well, the ASJA has a contracts committee, and that's a committee that answers contract questions for our members. And I was chairman of that committee for 6-7 years. I moved from there to the board of directors, from the board of directors to being vice president for 2 years, and now I'm halfway through my second year as president. So again, it's giving back to a profession that matters, and I enjoy it. It's complicated at times, and at times it's a full-time job, which makes writing difficult. But that's how I got involved in it. And the organization, we have about 1,100 members right now. Everyone is a freelance writer of nonfiction primarily. We have a few people who do fiction as well, mostly magazine writers, a few book authors, but it's all nonfiction, and it's all freelance. So we have a very focused membership, and we also have a very qualified membership. It isn't just you write your check and you become a member. We have a fairly high criteria for becoming a member. You have to have a certain number of publications in national publications. And you can become a member with 1 or 2 books that have been published by a traditional publisher. And the advantage of this is if you are an ASJA member, you've gotten over the first hurdle when you're talking to an editor. The editor knows that you've been vetted already, so that they are much more likely to want to hire you. We have an annual convention every year in New York, and the most popular part of this convention is something that we call client connections. And client connections are basically speed dating on steroids for writers. At the 2019 convention, we had over 60 editors and publishers who were there willing to talk to our members for 10-minute interviews. We arranged almost 800 interviews in that afternoon. And a lot of people get work that way. It's the most popular thing that we do. So that's the way the organization works. We also have a charitable arm, and we have a writer's emergency assistance fund. If a member, or a non-member for that matter, has some sort of emergency or a crisis that means they can't pay their rent, we give grants.
That's
So
fabulous.
it's an interesting organization. We also are involved right now in a lawsuit in California. There is a new law in California that restricts what a freelance writer or freelance photographer can do. We joined with the National Press Photographers Association and filed a lawsuit challenging the constitutionality of these restrictions, and we'll see how that goes.
That is incredible work that you're doing, and you're organizing the authors, you're helping the authors get work, you're caretaking
Hmm.
the writers and the authors, you're caretaking these freelance writers, and you're standing for their rights, which is fabulous. Thank you for sharing with us about that and your
Yeah, you're
contribution to the
welcome.
organization. These organizations are very important.
Yeah. And you know what American Horse Publications does for us. It's also a wonderful resource.
Absolutely. And actually the American Horse Publications is where you and I first met. And the next question kind of touches on this too. And for those people that may not be familiar with the American Horse Publications, do you want to just give a little, log line about, what that
Sure.
organization does and how they help us?
Sure, AHP, unlike ASJA, which is strictly for writers, AHP is for writers, it's for photographers, it's for publishers, it's for magazine folks, it's for book publishers, it's for people who provide services to the horse industry. It's the only organization I know of that includes everybody involved in a particular niche. And that's what's so valuable about it. One of the things you can do is you get access to their listserv where you can run press releases. That's one of
Mm-hmm.
the big deals about being a member. So there's a lot of communication there, but it isn't just among writers. It's everybody who is involved in equine media.
Mm-hmm. And it's a very, very great I made so many beautiful relationships, like
Hmm.
not just connections and networking, but friends from this organization. And it just every year they offer a conference. This year it's their 50th anniversary in Kentucky. So, and that's a great opportunity to meet
Hmm.
people and sit in on sessions where you can learn how to grow your writing career and your businesses. And that's what I'm getting to right now. So you are a popular public speaker on the business side of writing, copyright, publishing contracts, and other legal issues affecting writers. I've seen your very informative sessions that you've done during the American Horse Publications Conference. Why did you decide to offer speaking services, and how did you get involved with that?
I've known Chris Brune, who is the executive director, for many years. And again, it's another opportunity to give back to an industry.
Mhm.
And plus, I like to talk, which is part of being an attorney. But the other thing is, it gives me a reason to keep up with what's going on in the legal world. Really actively practicing much anymore, although I'm actually AHP's legal counsel.
Mm.
But it gives me a reason to keep up with trends and contracts. It gives me a reason to keep up with the law in California. That sort of thing, which is what I really enjoy. And I enjoy public speaking.
Yeah, well, and you're very good at it and very confident, and it's very clear here. What are some of your favorite topics when you do these, or do the organizations come to you and say, "I'd like you to talk on this," or do you usually like what are your favorite topics to touch on?
It's a little of both. For AHP, if I come up with something that I think is interesting, I mention it to Chris or to somebody else who's on the board and say, would you like to do a session about this? One of the things that I will suggest to them this year for the conference in Lexington is about these laws that are restricting what freelancers do. We have a law in California, but there's proposed legislation in New Jersey and New York, maybe Illinois. It's probably coming up in Washington and Oregon. And there's federal legislation that does the same thing that will affect everybody. So I'm looking at an update on that at least.
And that's so great because educating yourself about what's going on and how this can impact the work that you're doing is so important as an author and a journalist and a freelancer. You have to know what's going on because your rights are being looked at and
Yeah.
new bills are being proposed that can impact how you do your work.
Absolutely. And that's the nice thing about AHP. Most everybody who is involved in the equine publishing media industry will be there. You're reaching the audience that needs to hear this.
Absolutely. And thank you for the work that you keep doing with AHP. And I always look forward to sitting in on your sessions and
Well,
seeing you
thanks.
there. So I'm curious, like when you started out on your author journey as an author of books. Is there something that you wish you had known when you first started out that you would go back and tell your aspiring author self?
That's a really difficult question. What I think I would tell people to do is to not plan on being successful. That doesn't mean you won't be successful, but if you start out with that as a goal, that really limits what you can do, because you find yourself trying to duplicate what has been successful in the past. For example, when I was writing or working on the Dancer's Image book, I started that idea with the notion of a 60s era Seabiscuit. And I learned fairly quickly that publishers were not interested in a 60s version of Seabiscuit. So I shifted back to what I knew, which was the legal side of the only disqualification of a Kentucky Derby winner for drug positive, and didn't worry particularly about how popular it would be or how well it would sell. And the other advantage of that is winning awards like the Tony Ryan Award or the American Horse Publications Award it's just sort of gravy. So yeah, it would, don't write to be successful. Don't try and do what has worked for other people. Well, it's really hard.
Yeah, well, and I would say, well, and to be realistic, right? So for every book that we sell, we make $1 or something. Yeah. So, so it takes an awful lot to be a successful author. But I think the reward is in the writing itself and following the muse and not putting unnecessary pressure on yourself to be a massive success, and as you write more books and as you generate a backlist, it's all those revenue streams coming together that actually, I think, ends up generating the success. You're not going to walk out the door and hit hit a book that, well, I hope you do. I think that would be amazing, like an instant bestseller. But generally, like when these people hit the bestseller list, they have a backlist and they've been working at this for a very, very long time and building networks and improving their writing skills and growing as an author. And then I think that's where success comes in, is like working at the craft. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. And you can't ever rest on your laurels. You want to always have the thing you write today better than the thing you wrote yesterday, whatever it is.
I absolutely agree. And I think that's sort of natural too. It kind of comes with the more you write, the better you get. And, the quality of your work grows and you learn, right? It's a never ending learning game. And I think this is an interesting question, because you mentioned that you're not very active on social media and so how do you reach your readers if you're not really playing that game? Like what do you do to reach your readers? What's been the best avenue for you?
I'm not sure that there is a best avenue. I've relied on publicity, primarily that is generated when a book comes out. There are a rash of book signings, a rash of interviews, particularly if the timing is right. One of the things that helped the Dancer's Image book is part of my contract with the History Press was, if I get you the manuscript on this particular date, you guarantee that I'll have the book in my hands before the Kentucky Derby the next year. And that was an incredible marketing coup. I got phone calls from people all over the country, radio stations who wanted interviews, magazine people who were writing about the Derby. So for me, the mechanics of marketing involve the timing of the marketing as much as anything else. I don't do enough to exploit those things, to exploit the interviews, to exploit the awards. I posted on Facebook a photograph of the Shergar book with its trophy from the Equus Film Festival. That was the extent of my Facebook postings. I have the plans to post something about the magazine article that won at the Equus Festival that I haven't gotten around to yet. So that's, for me, I post something on Facebook every now and then. I post on Twitter 2 or 3 times a year, probably. I've got a LinkedIn account. I don't even know how to use Instagram. So I'm missing out a lot, I suspect, here, because every time I look at Facebook or LinkedIn or Twitter or anything, this seems like it's an incredible marketing tool.
It
I
is.
just don't know
And
how to do it.
yeah, and you know what's cool is you can listen to this podcast to get some tips on how to use some of those systems to your best advantage, because that's what this is all about. It's a
Yeah.
learning space for people.
Hmm.
And I think here's the other thing, Milt. I think that we can always be doing more, right? Like I think that you have done a magnificent job when it comes to winning awards and being featured in the press
Hmm.
and working with the media and attending events and doing book signings, and particularly for nonfiction, timing your releases to
Hmm.
events that help elevate, tidal wave your book into the right places. So I think that you're doing a lot. There may be authors that are just focused on social media and
Hmm.
missing out on all
Yeah.
the stuff that you're doing, right? So it's just, I think with marketing and publicity, it's like you pick and choose what works for you. Like if you're not you can waste a whole lot of time on social media. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like you do what works for you. And there are actually seminars out there and articles that are written
Hmm.
about how you can be a successful author without having to be dependent
Yeah.
on social media. So it is a good opportunity, but if it's not a right fit, there's other things that you can be doing.
Yeah.
So kudos for posting about your award with the trophy though on Facebook. That's good.
But again, you're talking about timing. Uh, Shergar was stolen on the 8th of February,
Mhm.
1983. I wanted to do a long form piece for thebloodhorse.com. And again, it was about 7,500 words. And part of the deal was that I would get it to them in time that it could go live online on February the 8th of three or 4 years ago.
Mhm.
And it got a lot of comments from the
Mhm.
article. And the article was what I used as part of my book proposal to sell the Shergar book to the University Press of Kentucky.
Perfect.
So the timing of the article was good because I got a lot of good comments, and I also had a sample chapter to show the UK press, along with 100 people who said, "Hey, this is a really neat story."
Mhm.
So like you said earlier, it all works together. Nothing that we do stands on its own 2 feet. There's something behind it, and there's something going on at the same time, and there's something in the future.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's looking at like how you can utilize timing and a piece to make a
Hmm.
proposal, so it's like it all works together, so good. And if you ever need or ever want to sit down and chat about social media, lasso me at the American Horse Publications. I'm happy to sit down and share with you some of the
I'll
stuff.
keep that in mind. Thank you.
Yeah, no, my pleasure. Is there a common myth about our uh, profession or field that you want to debunk? And you've already mentioned don't go into it hoping to be an instant success, and that we don't make a whole lot of money. Is there anything else that you would want to demystify?
The only thing that comes to mind is I think the perception of being a writer is that you are a solitary person,
Mm,
that you're sitting in your office doing whatever it is that you do.
mm-hmm,
And I am a solitary person by nature, but writing is a team project.
mm,
The writing may not be, but the research certainly is. The production of the magazine article or the book or whatever certainly is. You've got a whole team of people who are doing that. The readers are part of the team too. So yeah, I write by myself, but I discuss what I'm writing on walks with the dogs. They're very good listeners.
they
And
are.
and then we've got my wife and I discuss things that the writing is involving. The editors discuss things. There's editing process. There's everything comes together again, like you said earlier, to make the final product. And the more people you involve, and the better people you involve. That's the key. If you're going to consult with somebody, make sure that they know what they're doing.
Mm.
But it all comes together to come up with a product that you like. So it's a solitary activity that involves a whole lot of people, if that makes any sense.
That makes a lot of sense, and I completely agree with that assessment. I always like to ask this one too. What for you has been the hardest part of being, a writer, author, and then on the flip side, like what's the very best part for you?
And making time to do whatever needs to be done.
Mm-hmm.
And as I said, I don't multitask, so I need to work on something for a while and then shift gears and work on something else. So just time management is always a problem.
Mm-hmm.
Managing research is a problem.
Mm.
The the Shergar book produced 3 legal-sized file boxes of stuff
Oh, wow. That's a
that
lot to manage.
it's a lot to manage, and I don't do things. I don't manage things electronically. I don't scan stuff and do digital stuff so I could
Mhm.
search for it. And the book came out in October of 2018. I still wake up maybe at least once a month, maybe twice, thinking, this should have gone in the book.
Hmm.
So it's frustrating to deal with the management of time and the management of research, just getting stuff done.
Mhm.
The nicest thing is when somebody unexpectedly says, I read your book and I really liked it, or it made a difference in my understanding of something.
Oh, that is the
So
best part.
that's
Yeah.
what matters.
Mhm.
That's why I do this.
Mhm. We do. We write for our readers.
Hmm.
I was wondering, all that research that you have you ever considered perhaps like donating it to like like the Kentucky Horse Park or museum or something like that? I mean, is there a way to utilize that research?
There probably is. One of the places where I've done an extraordinary amount of research for everything that I've written is the Keeneland Library,
Mm-hmm.
which, if you haven't been there, you need to go. It's an extraordinary place. The librarians are wonderful, and they take donations of material. They archive things. They want to be the sort of the official historian of racing. So yeah, that's the thought of. I've got boxes and boxes of stuff in the garage.
Yeah, I mean that could be a very cool
Yeah.
contribution,
Hmm.
to all the research that you did
Yeah.
do, and then give it a place to live, beyond the books. So
Yeah.
I think that would be pretty neat. And here's another thing: you talk about this enormous amount of research and information that you gather when you do write your books. Do you have any actual writing rituals or routines when you sit down? Like, how do you find the time to get those words on the page?
Well, not very well is the short answer to that. But my writing, if there is a ritual, it is that I spend an awful lot of time thinking about stuff, thinking about what I'm going to write.
Mm-hmm.
And that there's way more of that than there is actually, sitting down at a keyboard and writing.
Mm-hmm.
I know a lot of people are first draft writers and they don't really care how good the first draft is, and you expect it to be terrible. I expect to get a lot of the terrible ideas and the terrible phrasing and the terrible writing out of the way before I actually start.
Mm.
And I mentioned discussing this with the dogs. I actually do that. I talk to them about, hey, what do you think about this chapter? Where does it go? That sort of thing. I work out a lot of what I write in my mind before I start writing anything. And for me, that works.
And do you like capture it in like little bullet points or outlines? Like, I know that if something pops, like I think about my writing a lot too, and if something comes to mind, I have to write it down or else it kind of goes away. Is it like that for you?
It is more and more as I've gotten older. I have trouble remembering things. So I have Post-it notes stuck everywhere.
I do too. I love post-it
And
notes.
and the downside of that is I often can't read my writing.
Oh my.
I have terrible penmanship. So, but yeah, that's always a problem.
Hmm. Yeah. So post-its, talking to the dogs, and
Yeah.
working out in your head before you sit down to write. And then, how, like, when you sit down to write, do you write until you just don't want to go anymore? Do you set a particular time or a word count, or do you just, how does that work for you?
Um, I don't have a word count that I try and meet every day. I don't have a particular amount of time. I write until I get bored with writing.
Hmm.
And sometimes that is an afternoon or a morning. Sometimes it's 10 minutes.
Hmm.
I'm pretty good at realizing when I'm not being productive, and that's when I quit and do
Yeah.
something else. And
Yeah.
I have enough other things going on now that it's always easy to find something else to do, to take my mind off the writing.
Mm-hmm. That's good. That's great advice. You have to give
Yeah.
yourself a break every now and then. It's like, don't force it if it doesn't want to come. Like, wait for the
Mm-hmm.
muse. I like to wait for the muse to pop up, and often the muse comes when I'm out cleaning stalls, or like you said,
Yeah.
walking the dogs, or
Mm-hmm.
working out of the gym or something, and I have to go and scramble and write it down, or
Yeah.
talking to my phone, or send myself an email or something, so I remember these. Um, Is there anything that a reader might be surprised to learn about you? Like, can you karate chop a board in half, or do you like a particular type of strange food, or is there anything surprising about you that a reader might not know?
That's a tough question. And yes, I can break a board. I have a black belt in Shaolin Kung Fu.
Oh, wow. I must be like psychic. I can't believe I just said that. Like, I didn't assume that you could do that.
So yes, I can do that. I do a lot of bicycling. I was a competitive power lifter for a while.
Wow. You're
So
the second power lifter on the show. Do you know that? That is really
no,
incredible.
really? Okay.
Yeah. Joanne Viricos, I interviewed. She's from Australia, a couple of weeks ago, and she also was a power lifter, and she named her horse that she bred Powerlifter after her introduction to powerlifter. Yeah. So what was the most you could power lift at one time?
My best squat was 425 pounds. My deadlift was a little over 500, and my bench press was terrible because my arms are so long.
That's incredible. Milt is tall. just
Yeah.
For those listening in. And then, we already covered what you're curious about. You're working on this new project about drugs in the horse racing business. So will you let readers or listeners, know where they can find you and your books?
The website is miltonctoby.com, www.miltonctoby.com. The books are all at Amazon.
Fantastic. And I will link to your website and the different places where people can find your books in the show notes. Milt, I really appreciate your time today, and thank you for being so friendly and fun and informative every time I meet you at the AHP Conference and at the Equus Film Festival. It's been a joy knowing you as a fellow author and horse enthusiast. So thank you for the gift of your time today.
This is the sort of thing I like to do. So.
Yeah, and look at this. This is you getting the word out about your books without needing social media, because I'm going to take care of that part for you. See?
That's right.
See? So go for the podcast. It works out well.
Works for me. I'm really impressed with your homework.
Oh, well, thank you. I have a bit of a journalist background myself.
Yeah.
I have a communications major.
That's clear.
Well, thank you.
I thoroughly enjoyed it. So thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us this week on the Equestrian Author Spotlight podcast. I hope you enjoy these Q&A sessions with wonderful equine authors who love all things horses and writing, just like me. Visit my website, carlycadecreative.com, where you can read the show notes, and make sure you never miss a show by clicking the subscribe button now. This podcast is made possible by listeners like you. Thank you so much for your support. Want a free guide to secrets of horsebook authors? Gallop over to carlycadecreative.com/wisdom to have author advice delivered instantly to your inbox. If you are an author who writes about horses and would like to be spotlighted, please let me know. Visit my contact page at carlycadecreative.com to fill out a request. I'd be happy to have you on the show too. Thank you for tuning in to the Equestrian Author Spotlight podcast. See you next time. I'm your host, Carly Kade. Creative writing makes my spurs jingle.